as Jan just mentioned, we will present our joint paper, which is called the Macroeconomic Implications of Zero Growth, a post-Keynesian approach. Okay, so let me just start talking about the motivation that we have for writing this paper, and also a little bit about the previous literature dealing with the issue of zero growth or ecological constraints in post-Keynesian macro. And in general, I would say that there is a fundamental question behind the interest of studying zero growth economies, and it has to do with whether it is possible to decouple economic growth from negative environmental impacts, or following the planetary boundaries framework, whether it is possible for an expanding economy to respect such boundaries. So we know that there is some evidence of relative decoupling, but there's still many doubts that it will be environmental targets. So in that sense, we see an increased interest, especially in the last decade or so, in analyzing non-growing or degrowing economies as a possibility to tackle the climate crisis and other environmental constraints. Okay. Now, from a post-Keynesian perspective, we have several authors who have analyzed the different aspects of low growth or zero or degrowing economies. For example, we have the work by Fontana and Sawyer, who tried to integrate ecological constraints and the associated lower growth rates into post-Keynesian macro. We have the work by Rosenbaum, who analyzes the stability of zero growth in a Kaleckian model. But as pointed out by Monserrat, there are several inconsistencies in his work. We also have the work by Lange, who analyzes the conditions for sustainable economies without growth in different theories, including post-Keynesian theories. However, we don't have any stability analysis in that work. And finally, we have the work by Monserrat, who analyzes the stability of the degrowth transition in a neo-Kaleckian model, but doesn't consider the financial stability analyses. We also have another group of studies who have concentrated on the issue of growth imperatives, right? So it's this idea of a systemic need for growth in order to maintain stability in capitalist economies. So for example, the work by Richter and Simonite, who review several models and find that in fact a stationary state with positive profits and positive interest rates is possible as long as no sector is running financial deficits or surpluses, as long as we don't have any retained profits, we have a balanced government budget, and as long as we have saving out of household income, which is compensated for by consumption out of wealth. And these findings apply, for example, to the work by Cahen, Fourreau, and Lavoie, Jackson and Victor, and Berg et al., which in general follow a stock flow consistent modeling approach to address this issue of the growth imperatives, among other questions also, but who don't really analyze the dynamic stability of a stationary state, which is something that we aim to do in this paper. So that being said, our objective is to contribute to the debate of long-run stability of zero growth with positive profits and a positive rate of interest in a capitalist monetary production economy. And specifically, we aim at clarifying the requirements for the macroeconomic stability of zero growth, and we do so in a systematic way. So we begin by analyzing the requirements for zero growth from a national income accounting perspective. Then we complement that with a monetary circuit approach. And finally, we analyze short and long run stability issues within a Kaleckian autonomous demand-led growth model. Okay, so starting with the accounting perspective, we basically wanted to see what the implications of zero growth are on the goods market and the financial market, and then analyze the conditions for stability in both of them. Starting with the goods market, what we need basically is that effective demand is sufficient to generate and reproduce stationary output over time, even if we have zero net investment. So we have equation one, the usual identity for output as the sum of consumption out of rentiers income, consumption out of from the rentiers, from the workers, government expenditure, net investment, and net exports. And we know that for a stationary economy at some target level of output, which is consistent with ecological constraints, which we define as YT, we need that net investment is equal to 0. So that's how we get to equation 2. When it comes to the financial market, we know that the financial structure of a stationary economy should not generate systemic financial instability. So this means that we have to avoid ever rising debt income ratios of any sector. And to do so, the financial balances of each macro sector, meaning the workers' households, the rentiers' households, the corporate subsector, the public sector, and the external sector should be balanced at the stationary target level of output. So once again, from an accounting perspective, we also know that output should be equal to retained earnings, distributed profits, and the wages and the respective move everything to the right hand. Get that we need that the sum of the financial balances of each macroeconomic sector is equal to 0. Alternatively, we can define a saving equation and a taxing equation and get to this equation 5 here, which is saying that the financial balance of the private sector, of the government, and the foreign sector must add up to 0. But more than that, for the stability of a zero growth economy, we need that each financial balance is equal to 0 and not only the sum of them. This is because if this does not happen, some sectors would be building up financial assets over time, and others would be building up the counterpart financial liabilities. So we would see then rising financial asset income ratios or financial liability income ratios over time. And this would then violate the requirements for the stability of the financial market. Okay, so the fact that each financial balance has to be equal to 0 has some implications. Specifically, we know that saving out of rentiers and workers' income have to be 0. That the governments have to run a balanced budget, and that the current account balance has to be equal to 0. So we have net exports equal to 0. Finally, we also know that net investment is 0. So that means that we also need retained profits to be equal to 0 as well. Okay, so substituting that in our previous equation, we now have that our target output is equal to the sum of the consumption out of rentiers' income and workers' wages, plus the government expenditure. But more than that, what we get is that total net profits are equal to rentiers' net income, because we know that there are no retained profits, so they have to distribute it. It's equal to the rentiers' net income, and at the same time, we know that rentiers can't save. That means that this also has to be equal to the consumption out of rentiers' income. Okay, now moving on to the monetary circuit, we basically wanted to complement the accounting perspective with this monetary circuit approach. And we do so for this zero growth economy with initial government debt, and therefore interest payments of the government to the rentiers. From the previous analyses, we know that these equations here must hold. So basically, again, that rentiers spend their net income, that workers spend their net wages, and that governments have a balanced budget. This is how the balance sheet matrix looks like for this zero growth economy. So we have 5 sectors. We have a banking sector who is providing credit, in this case, to the debtor of the economy, which would be the government, and which also accepts deposits from the other sectors. We have the firms who are financing their capital stock with equity. This equity is held by the rentiers' households. And they also have some accumulated retained earnings to finance this capital. We also have the rentiers' households who hold deposits in the commercial banks, who hold part of the bonds from the government and the equity from the firms. Okay, now starting with to show you the monetary circuit for the zero growth economy, we have in the initial phase, we have initial finance from the bank, from the commercial bank to the government and to the firm sectors. And in this case, the initial finance for the firms consists of wages and the profits, and the initial finance for the government consists of the planned government expenditures plus the interest payments, since we are assuming that they have debt. In the second phase, we have income payments in advance. So this means the profits going from the firms to the rentiers' households, wages going to the workers' households, and also interest payments going into the rentiers' households. Then in the third phase, we have the income expenditures. So we know that the workers and the rentiers are paying taxes, and then they must consume their net incomes. And we also know that we have the government expenditure going into the firm sector. And then this phase, the third one, allows firms and government funds that they need for the repayment, which is the final phase of our monetary circuit. The repayment of the initial finance. And this transaction flow matrix then sums everything up, what we have been saying. So you can see here that the sum of the financial balances of each sector is equal to 0, which is this row here. And and we see in the bottom part, sorry, 1 second. Yeah, and we see also in the bottom part the changes in the financial assets and liabilities, which we know that for each sector also have to be 0, because we're saying once again that no one can be accumulating financial assets or liabilities. However, this doesn't mean that the portfolio structure can't change. It can, as long as this condition is met. So now I hand over to Eckhard, who will present the autonomous demand-led model.
Eckhard?
We can't hear you yet. You have your mic off.
Now you can hear me. Yeah, let me continue in the remaining 12 minutes where Valeria stopped. So far, I mean, we have just explored the accounting properties of a zero growth economy, and we have seen that we can have positive profits, that we can have a positive interest rate in this stationary economy. The next step, we start, and thanks Jan for reminding me that this is my first, or our first attempt at modeling that. We start with a familiar model, which is now being used in post-Keynesian economics, which has become quite popular in post-Keynesian economics, with a familiar model, an autonomous demand-led model, and explore the conditions in this model for stable zero growth. As you will see, this model has a nice property. Maybe it's too nice because it allows us to solve the adjustment of the firm sector towards zero growth by means of assuming that in the long run, firms' investment or firms' capital accumulation is guided by the autonomous growth rate of the system, which in our case is government expenditure. So we assume that government expenditure grows at a rate of 0 in the long run. The modeling is based on what is in the literature and what we've already tried ourselves for other purposes, and it includes some ideas which we find in the work of Amitava Dutt and also of Olivier Alain. Sorry, I should use the presentation mode, I guess. So this is what we do here. We allow for the short run of the model that we may be out of the stationary state so that we may grow, but we explore whether our model economy will then converge to zero growth in the long run. And we explore in particular the conditions for a stable convergence towards this long-run zero growth. The assumptions are as usual, and I don't want to read all of them because those of you who are familiar with Kalecki modeling will find them a bit boring. So what is important maybe is to highlight that we use the same model structure as Valeria has explained that for the monetary circuit approach. So we assume that there's no corporate debt, but only government debt, and we examine the stability of the government debt to capital ratio. We assume fixed coefficient technology. Our capital stock, for the sake of simplicity, is non-depreciating so that we can ignore depreciations. Distribution is determined by market pricing. The long-term finance of the capital stock is only by equity, as Valeria already pointed out. And we assume that all the profits being made are distributed to the shareholders of the firm sector. For the saving function, we assume that rentiers have a positive propensity to save out of income, and they also consume out of wealth. Workers don't save as usual in these models. So that's the saving function, which is normalized by the capital stock, in which you see that saving is out of net income, so out of profits and out of interest income, sorry, and rentiers consume out of wealth, which in effect means that their saving out of income is reduced by their consumption out of wealth. This is our accumulation function, which is the standard function for these types of models, in which we assume that firms invest according to their expectations of the trend rate of growth of sales, which is the alpha. And they speed up investment if capacity utilization exceeds some target or normal rate, which is the UN, and they decelerate accumulation if utilization falls short of this target rate of capacity utilization. We have the government expenditures normalized by the capital stock, which is the B in equation 16. We assume, for the sake of simplicity, that only rentiers are taxed here, and the tax rate on distributed profits and on interest income is the same. That's equation 17, which gives us the balanced budget condition in equation 18. We can then do the usual procedure in order to find the short-run equilibrium by applying the goods market equilibrium condition, which you see in 19. We have the stability condition for the goods market as usual, so saving has to respond more to utilization than capital accumulation, and then we can derive the short-run equilibrium. We can also, the short-run equilibrium for utilization, the rate of profit and the rate of capital accumulation. Since we can see the government budget balance from two perspectives. So either the government is flexibly adjusting the tax rate, or the government takes the tax rate as given and flexibly adjusts government expenditure. We can also derive an alternative short-run equilibrium, which of course has to be the same as the first one, by means of endogenizing the tax rate, which you see here. So from the balanced budget condition, we have a rate of utilization which satisfies this condition, and from which we then can derive the equilibrium tax rate in our economy, which leads us to an alternative presentation of the short-run equilibrium. I don't have time to go into the details here, but this short-run equilibrium follows all, or you can maybe already easily see it, follows all the results we have for the standard Kalecki model. So we have the paradox of thrift, we have the paradox of costs, and we have that an improvement of the assessment of the long-run growth rate by the firm sector also increases all endogenous growth. So this is the graphical presentation of our short-run equilibrium, which you see here, in which we have in the short run and a rate of utilization for the goods market equilibrium, which deviates from the target or the normal rate of utilization, which then means that the rate of growth may also deviate from the assessment of the trend rate of growth, which is positive here. So that's the short run. For the long run, we then apply a procedure or an assumption which Dutt has proposed, arguing that in the long run, the trend rate of growth or expected by the firm sector is given by the autonomous growth rate of the system. So in other words, the firms adjust their expectations to what, in our case, is announced by the government for its expenditures. And we know for a zero growth economy, this rate of growth has to be zero. So that's equation 29. And then we can examine, or we do examine, the dynamics of the government expenditures to capital ratio, which is the B, and the government debt to capital ratio, which is the lambda. So we have a 2x2 dynamic system, which you see in equation 30 and 32.
Eckhard, you have 4 minutes left.
Yeah, and what we get is then the adjustment in the long run towards the equilibrium with a zero rate of growth of capital accumulation given by the rate of growth of autonomous expenditure, the government, which is set equal to zero. So we see a downward shift of our investment function. And we see for the goods market an adjustment towards this equilibrium. And now we have to analyze whether this is also associated with a stable government debt to income or government debt to capital ratio. I don't want to bother you with all the details here, so the slides will be uploaded and the paper will then hopefully be published in the journal. So basically what we find is that we have a trivial long-run equilibrium in which both the government expenditures and the government debt to capital ratio is equal to zero, but that's not interesting for our analysis. But we can also derive a long-run equilibrium for the government debt and the government expenditures to capital ratio, which is non-zero, which you see here in equation 39, and here in equation 40. And that's what we now analyze, or the stability of these equilibria are now analyzed in our paper. We have, as I said, a 2x2 system. So we analyze the Jacobian of this 2x2 system around the long-run equilibrium. We find that we have a zero root system because the determinant is equal to zero. So we have a continuum of locally stable equilibria, provided that the trace is negative, and the trace will be negative as long as we have positive long-run equilibrium values for B, the government expenditures, and lambda, the government debt to capital ratio. The next step, we then analyze the conditions under which lambda and B are positive, and this is what you see here on this slide. It has to do with the relationship between the rate of interest, the consumption, propensity to consume out of wealth, and the normal rate of profit, which is the rate of profit at the normal rate or the target rate of capacity utilization. For B, for the government expenditures to capital ratio, the condition becomes a bit more complicated. And if we link these two, we get what you see here in equation 46 and 47. So we need a propensity to consume out of wealth, which is in between these two, or alternatively, we need again that the rate and the normal rate of profit exceeds the propensity to consume out of wealth divided by saving propensity out of the rentiers, out of their net income, and that has to exceed the rate of interest divided by this term in the denominators. This is the long run properties. I've already mentioned the short run. For the long run, we get the standard results, of course, that the propensity to save, the propensity to consume out of wealth, and the profit share have no effect on utilization, which is given by the normal rate, nor do they have effects on capital accumulation, which is given by the autonomous growth rate of the system, which is 0 in our model. Okay, let me conclude in the remaining 20 seconds. So we've shown in this paper that the stationary economy with positive profits and a positive interest rate is possible. This is evident from national income accounting and evident from using a monetary circuit approach. We have shown that a stationary economy does not generate systemic financial instability, which means rising financial assets or financial liabilities to income ratios. But Valeria has clearly pointed out the conditions for that. So it's not an unconditional stability, but it's conditional on that none of the sectors has positive or negative financial balances. And we've shown the conditions in a long-run dynamic model with simple behavior equations that stable zero growth is possible under the condition that the rate of interest is below the normal rate of profit, and that the consumption to consume out of wealth is not too small and not too large. What are the limits of our model? Well, the model is a closed economy model, but I think we could easily extend the method we've chosen to the open economy. So that would be easy. It takes a bit of time to do the derivations. We have not included any thoughts, at least in this paper, on structural change and productivity growth. And of course, this means that we have not discussed the issues of stability of full employment and the labor market. But I'm sure that the other papers in this workshop will touch upon these issues. Thank you very much for your attention. 1 minute over time, if my clock is right. So I hope this is
Thank you, Valeria and Eckhard.